What does the debate tell us about the foreign policy philosophy for Vice President Harris and President Trump? This is Kotow, and let's talk some politics. The September 10th debate provided an interesting window illustrating the foreign policy approach for both presidential candidates. As always, I wish there were more details on vision rather than revisionism for the past or straw manning of either candidate, but the debate format itself doesn't promote such a discussion. However, there's still a good amount for us to get into, both in specific policies and indications of their general philosophy. For this video, I will look at the policy proposals for international affairs by both VP Harris and President Trump. It is in this sector that the office of the president has the most influence and ability to shape outcomes, and I think it deserves special attention. I will attempt to provide some additional context and explanation where possible to their answers in this subject field. I will mostly endeavor to only bring up policy positions from the debate themselves, but I will mostly avoid analyzing interpretations for past events, as that would require a different method for analysis, namely examining the politicalization of history. With that being said, let's get into it. Starting with President Trump, his philosophy appears to continue to be what I describe as a realist approach to international relations, or what he might term an American first approach. He seeks to maximize benefits for the United States as the primary objective through competition, although not necessarily conflict with other states. Ideology and enduring relationships play little to no role in governing foreign relations in his approach, with immediate transactions as the general currency for engaging with other countries. Furthermore, trade relations should be conducted in a protectionist manner, in which U.S. industry and domestic production is prioritized. Alternatively, Vice President Harris's philosophy is more akin to a liberal or internationalist approach, which values cooperation internationally to develop long-term relationships as opposed to immediate advantage as the primary driver for foreign relations. Maintaining the current international system, or the rules or values-based international order created after World War II, is the primary objective for the United States in this orientation. It views U.S. interests as driven primarily by maintaining this overall system to the benefit of all nations, including the United States. As the guarantor of this system, it may mean sacrificing immediate U.S. interests and advantages in certain circumstances to preserve the overall system, which in the long term would be to the benefit of the United States. Furthermore, ideology and long-term relationships play a more important role in determining orientation towards relations with foreign powers than immediate advantage. Regarding international trade, lower trade barriers to diversify supply chains is viewed as a net benefit, as well as a method to maintain good relations, even at the detriment of immediate U.S. economic interests.
Statement. She knows that we're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world. And the tariff will be substantial in some cases. I took in billions and billions of dollars, as you know, from China. In fact, they never took the tariff off because there was so much money they can't. It would totally destroy everything that they've set out to do. They're taking in billions of dollars from China and other places. They've left the tariffs on. When I had it, I had tariffs, and yet I had no inflation. Look, we've had
because of tariffs.
They're not going to have higher prices. What's going to have, and who's going to have higher prices, is China and all of the countries that have been ripping us off for years. I was the only president ever. China was paying us hundreds of billions of dollars, and so were other countries. And you know,
starting with trade policy, Trump has made clear he seeks to impose tariffs on imported goods, and in fact phrases it as a payback for establishing and maintaining the international order and favorable trade relations with other nations in the past. Tariffs serve a dual purpose. One, which he mentions directly, is that it serves as an additional revenue stream for the government, paid by foreign exporters to the U.S. market. The other benefit is that the increased cost for the imported good in turn makes domestically produced goods more attractive as an alternative, thus driving up production and increasing both American demand and hopefully creating a positive feedback loop to generate economic growth.
Let's be clear that the Trump administration resulted in a trade deficit, one of the highest we've ever seen in the history of America. He invited trade wars. You want to talk about his deal with China? What he ended up doing is, under Donald Trump's presidency, he ended up selling American chips to China to help them improve and modernize their military, basically sold us out, when a policy about China should be in making sure the United States of America wins the competition for the 21st century, which means focusing on the details of what that requires, focusing on relationships with our allies, focusing on investing in American-based technology so that we win the race on AI, on quantum computing, focusing on what we need to do to support America's workforce so that we don't end up having
However, there are potential risks for such a policy, one alluded to by Vice President Harris in her response. The first is a risk of a trade war occurring, in which there is a cycle of reprisals of reciprocal tariffs that only serve to drive up the prices for both countries involved. The other danger is that often exporters simply raise their prices to account for the increased tariff rate, passing on the cost to the U.S. consumer. At some point, if the cost becomes too great, the U.S. consumer will switch to the American product, but this will likely only come after a higher price has set in long enough to change spending habits, and assuming that U.S. production can actually match this new demand at all. Unfortunately, Vice President Harris did not present much in the way of her approach on trade policy. She did seem to indicate that she would pursue placing trade restrictions on dual-use technology, that is, technologies that can be used for both military and civilian purposes, to China, particularly in the form of chips, semiconductors, but there wasn't any particular policy position as to how she would approach implementing such restrictions. She did frame relations with China as a competition, echoing an approach by the Biden administration, avoiding direct conflict but seeking competitive advantage over the PRC. She did mention focusing on allied relationships, indicating a need to maintain favorable trade relationships as a way to curtail Chinese influence internationally. She also mentioned investment in the United States as a way to drive U.S. technological competitive advantage, specifically for AI and quantum computing. It is worth noting that there are a number of challenges with such an approach. First is that supply chains necessary to support this development often intersect with Chinese or Chinese influence interests, creating a new vector of competition and potentially conflict. Next, development of these systems requires substantial energy, not only in raw terms but also in the form of infrastructure, requiring further investment to upgrade the already strained U.S. electrical grid. Finally, direct investment, either through tax credits or direct government spending, will inject additional liquidity into the U.S. financial markets, placing further inflationary pressures on the economy. The next major foreign policy subject that I want to discuss is the Ukrainian conflict. President Trump indicated that he seeks a cessation of hostilities as his main priority, rather than the advancement of any strategic objectives for either the United States or Ukraine. He framed his approach as motivated by a desire to end the loss of life, as well as concern for escalation with Russia, a nuclear power. In his estimation, this conflict did not advance U.S. interests and merely presented risks for the United States, thus a need to end the conflict as soon as possible through a negotiated settlement, the exact contours of which were largely inconsequential to him, it appears.
Save lives that are being uselessly, people being killed by the millions. It's the millions. It's so much worse than the numbers that you're getting, which are fake numbers. Look, we're in for 250 billion or more because they don't ask Europe, which is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are. They're in for $150 billion less because Biden and you don't have the courage to ask Europe like I did with NATO. They paid billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars when I said, either you pay up or we're not going to protect you anymore. So that's maybe one of the reasons they don't like me as much as they like weak people. But you take a look at what's happening. We're in for 250 to 275 billion. They're into 100 to 150. They should be forced to equalize. With that being said, I want to get the war settled. I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship, and they respect your president, okay? They respect me. They don't respect Biden. How would you respect him? Why? For what reason? He hasn't even made a phone call in 2 years to Putin, hasn't spoken to anybody. They don't even try and get it. That is a war that's dying to be settled. I will get it settled before I even become president. If I win, when I'm president-elect, and what I'll do is I'll speak to one, I'll speak to the other, I'll get them together. That war will
He further indicated his perception for the lack of strategic interests by highlighting what he described as an imbalance in investment into Ukraine's defense expenditures by European powers, which he argued had far more at stake in the conflict and should therefore carry a higher cost burden as a result. He indicated he would not only lobby for increased investment by European countries in this project, but likely would pull back U.S. aid if it was not matched by Europe. He argued that his personal hand in diplomacy would allow for a cessation of hostilities to occur, engaging with both Presidents Putin and Zelensky to force a solution. Although details remained elusive, he asserted that it would occur before he even assumed the office of president. Interestingly, though, there have been some indications by both Zelensky and Putin that negotiations may occur in November aimed at war termination. The levers which Trump may pull to achieve this end is either throttling support for Ukraine up or down to bridge gaps in the negotiation positions for either party. Most likely, this would freeze the conflict along existing lines. But with Russia certainly in a substantial mobilization effort for its economy and military, it's unclear whether such an end to the conflict would also terminate Russia's revanchist behavior.
President Biden.
Well, first of all, it's important to remind the former president you're not running against Joe Biden, you're running against me. I believe the reason that Donald Trump says that this war would be over within 24 hours is because he would just give it up. And that's not who we are as Americans. Let's understand what happened here. I actually met with Zelensky a few days before Russia invaded, tried through force to change territorial boundaries, to defy one of the most important international rules and norms, which is the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I met with President Zelensky. I shared with him American intelligence about how he could defend himself. Days later, I went to NATO's eastern flank, to Poland and Romania. And through the work that I and others did, we brought 50 countries together to support Ukraine in its righteous defense. And because of our support, because of the air defense, the ammunition, the artillery, the javelins, the Abrams tanks that we have provided, Ukraine stands as an independent and free country. If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine. Understand why the European allies and our NATO allies are so thankful that you are no longer president, and that we understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO, and what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence. Otherwise, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv with his eyes on the rest of Europe, starting with...
Vice President Harris expressed an entirely different perspective of the war, presenting the ultimate objective of U.S. policy as the restoration of the antebellum status quo through the restoration of Ukrainian sovereign territory. She frames this objective through both realist and liberal terms. From the realist perspective, she invokes the domino theory, in which failure to stop the advancement of an aggressive power will only invite their further aggression and toppling of other states down the line. In this case, not only would Putin annex Ukraine, but would then pursue other territorial ambitions, specifically mentioning Poland as the next likely target. Historical memory of appeasement vis-a-vis World War II and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain often accompanies this argument. And it has been repeated often in U.S. discourse to justify international engagement. One such example is LBJ pursuing a similar line of thought to justify U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict. The other angle which she approaches the problem from is the liberal or internationalist, focusing on ideology as a key driver. Particularly, she notes a need to support allies and friends, which are democratic, as opposed to enemies, which she frames as strongmen and authoritarian. This places the type of government as a key determinant in international relations. Another plank of the liberal internationalist theory can be seen in what is often described as the democratic peace theory, basically being an observation that democracies rarely engage in conflict with other democracies. She also once more notes the need to uphold the rules-based international order as the objective for the United States in supporting Ukraine, specifically bringing up the need to maintain territorial integrity and sovereignty as a cornerstone of this system. The United Nations Charter's Article 2 articulates this requirement for all of its members. However, so far, the Biden-Harris administration has not offered, in my view, a coherent strategy nor provided sufficient capability, according to the Ukrainians, to launch any effective offensives to reclaim lost territory in the terms she discussed. Nor did Vice President Harris offer any details on approaches or novel ideas in her debate responses to alter the balance of power in the conflict. The objective may be victory, but strategy requires matching means and ways to ends. And at this point, so far, the only thing that has been achieved is preventing Ukraine from losing, rather than enabling it to win. There also wasn't an answer from Harris on how she would mitigate the inherent risks for a nuclear-armed Putin reacting to losing all territory he had gained, including Crimea, in this conflict, in the event of a total Ukrainian military victory. For some context, the first intervention by the United States post-World War II was in Korea, in which the United States accepted a frozen conflict for over 7 decades, foregoing any notion of a victory and settling for essentially a return to the antebellum status quo.
Would have never happened. Iran was broke under Donald Trump. Now Iran has $300 billion because they took off all the sanctions that I had. Iran had no money for Hamas or Hezbollah or any of the 28 different spheres of terror. And they are spheres of terror, horrible terror. They had no money. It was a big story, and you know it. You covered it very well, actually. They had no money for terror. They were broke. Now they're a rich nation, and now what they're doing is they're spreading that money around. Look at what's happening with the Houthis and Yemen. Look at what's going on in the Middle East. This would have never happened.
The Middle East, and particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, also received attention by both candidates, further illustrating differences in their foreign policy philosophies. President Trump indicated that his approach to the conflict would be to weaken Iran economically in order to mitigate their efforts to fund activities detrimental to Israel's security, specifically through a sanctions regime. The benefit for this approach is that it applies pressure on Iran without resorting to direct conflict, while simultaneously weakening the numerous vectors for aggression throughout the Middle East, targeting both U.S. and Israeli interests. Once more, this would utilize U.S. power, particularly economic, to pursue discrete U.S. interests vis-a-vis interstate relations. The risk, though, with such an approach is that the international situation has shifted since President Trump was previously in office, with the economic integration of Iran with other nations, specifically through its initiation into the BRICS economic bloc. It is unclear whether sufficient economic pressure can now be placed on Iran through a similar regime to have the impacts necessary to degrade their downstream support.
Children, mothers, what we know is that this war must end. It must end immediately, and the way it will end is we need a ceasefire deal and we need the hostages out. And so we will continue to work around the clock on that. Work around the clock, also understanding that we must chart a course for a two-state solution. And in that solution, there must be security for the Israeli people and Israel, and in equal measure for the Palestinians. But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself, in particular as it relates to Iran and any threat that Iran and its proxies pose to Israel. But we must have a two-state solution where we can rebuild Gaza, where the Palestinians have security, self-determination, and the dignity they so rightly deserve.
For VP Harris, she indicated she would take a more direct approach, once more closely aligned with the internationalist orientation. She made clear her support for Israel's right to self-defense and indicated her support to defend Israel against actions by Iran, either directly or indirectly, which threatened its security. For the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, she indicated a priority for a cessation of hostilities and restoration of the antebellum status quo, not seeking the achievement of Israel's objectives for eliminating Hamas as a political and military entity. Rather, she has prioritized ending humanitarian suffering for the people of Gaza as a primary objective, alongside the release of Israeli hostages held there. She did offer some indication for plans to deal with the underlying issues, namely through a two-state solution. This plan would provide for a nation-state for both Israel and the Palestinians, one determined by the international value of national self-determination. However, it is unclear whether there is a political appetite either in Israel or in the myriad of political and military powers that exist in the Palestinian territories and beyond for such a solution, or what levers VP Harris might employ to reach such a conclusion. I'm going to editorialize here briefly, and I hope you will forgive me, but there was a statement from VP Harris which I feel compelled to address.
As a result, America's taxpayers are not paying the $300 million a day we were paying for that endless war. And as of today, there is not one member of the United States military who is in active duty in a combat zone in any war zone around the world, the first time this century. But let's understand how.
First, she frames the end of involvement in Afghanistan not based on an internationalist approach, but rather in more realist, or dare I say, Trumpian terms, based on cost analysis. This is certainly a valid approach of measuring investment versus objectives in military policy. But this is an interesting departure for her in discussing foreign policy, as she has been very committed to a values-based approach in her other iterations. However, the main issue I have is her statement that, quoting, "And as of today, there is not one member of the United States military who is in active duty in a combat zone, in any war zone around the world, the first time this century." I believe I understand what she is attempting to convey, that the military operations post 9/11 have ended, and there are no such operations at scale occurring today, which is certainly true. I would argue her statement, though, is misleading, as U.S. service members are deployed in combat zones with active combat still occurring in many theaters, albeit nowhere near the scale as the OEF-OIF years. In January this year, 3 U.S. service members from the Georgia National Guard on active duty were killed by a drone attack in Jordan as they were deployed in support of counter-ISIS operations. In the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, U.S. naval assets are engaged in active combat operations with Houthi forces targeting vessels transiting the area, with 2 U.S. service members drowning while engaging in operations to intercept Iranian weapons shipments into Somalia earlier this year. Last month, 5 service members were wounded by enemy action, with another 2 incurring injuries while they conducted counter-ISIS operations in Iraq. I understand Vice President Harris's point, and it is worth acknowledging, but I wish to make clear that service members of the United States military are, in fact, still in combat operations across multiple theaters of conflict, with casualties resulting from these operations. But what do you think? Whose approach to foreign policy do you think would be more effective? Is there any area of foreign policy you wish to see more from for either candidate? And what did you think of my analysis? Let me know in the comments below. This is Kotal, and thanks for watching.